April 5th edition of Back Roads of Illinois. We were Central Illinois agriculture source and the agricultural industry in Central Illinois and across the Midwest. Guest on today is Nick Seltzer from the University of Illinois in Urbana and Champaign. We were talking about pesticides and recommendations for this planting season, and on Wednesday, I will visit our friend with Todd Gleason from the University of Illinois Extension in Urbana and Champaign. We were talking about the farm doc projection and their winter meeting. This is your agricultural storyline for today. The farmers is getting ready for this planting season with the acreage report. They will pick the beans in the Midwest. However, the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimate report is coming out for next week. There are some concerns about the Farm Bill in Washington, D.C. between the Republicans and Democrats as well, but they are looking for the CPR and SNAP program. Democrats will vote for the CPR program for farmers. The Illinois ag officials are concerned about Baltimore Bridge collapsed. Fertilizer shipping is for this planting season. How are you, Nick?
Oh, hi, Caesar. I'm doing well this morning. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with our conversation about pesticides. It's in the court for right now alongside with Roundup. Could you tell our audience about these issues?
Yeah, there are a few different issues going on with pesticides. Of course, I'm an entomologist, so I work in insecticides primarily. We've had a number of kind of high-profile things. So the material chlorpyrifos, Lorsban, is a little bit in limbo right now. So the registration was pulled, and then it was sort of re-granted with some, stipulations, some ability to use existing stocks. And now just recently, there are going to be some endangered species sort of limitations placed on that material. We're unlikely to really have that available to us long term, I would say, in agriculture. The big thing we are starting to deal with, just like the herbicides, our insecticide labels are going to see some major changes over the next few years in an effort to make them compliant with the Endangered Species Act. And so just like we are going to have to with herbicides, we'll be required to use these bulletins online to access sort of area-specific restrictions, most of which involve buffer zones and maybe runoff mitigation efforts and that kind of thing, but all in an effort to reduce the impact to endangered species. And there are some endangered species which are insects. So as you might imagine, in areas where those are present, things like the rusty patch bumblebee in particular, there may be some pretty dramatic restrictions on some of our materials. And it's just going to be over the next several months to a year that we'll learn kind of how extensive that's going to be with insecticides in particular.
Yes, I saw that on the news lately. Did you see some yields for last year with armyworm on corn in Central Illinois?
We didn't see a lot of armyworm last year. If you all remember, a few years ago, we had a very large influx of fall armyworm late in the season, and the years all kind of run together for me now, but I think that was 2021 when we saw that. That's not something we see every year. Of course, fall armyworm is a migratory pest. It's flying in from the southern United States, and we're kind of inheriting the issues that they have down there. 2021, we just happen to have very favorable weather to our south throughout the year to develop a very large population of that insect. More commonly in Illinois, we see an insect called the true armyworm. We see that a little earlier in the year. Of course, true armyworm also doesn't overwinter in Illinois, but it overwinters a little bit closer than fall armyworm does. And so we see them earlier in the season. We see that insect especially associated with wheat and grassy weed cover, and in some cases, grass cover crops. And that's something we see a little bit of every year, generally kind of a minor issue. Die down, the leaves are no longer attractive for those larvae to feed on, and then they go in search of other tissue, other grass tissues in particular. And that's why very often where we see armyworm damage in corn, it's on the margin with a wheat field. And as that wheat field starts to dry down, the armyworms move over into corn. The other thing you will see from armyworms occasionally, if you're a wheat producer, is once they sort of run out of material, green material to feed on that wheat plant, they get kind of desperate and they start chewing on the stems up at the top, and they can actually cause the heads to fall off of those plants in some cases. Doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, that can be a fairly serious yield reducer in wheat. But yeah, I mean, 2023 was, I would say, kind of an average year for armyworm. We had some areas with issues. We had a lot of other areas that didn't really have a problem, and that's kind of what we tend to see with that insect. It'll be driven a lot by weather patterns early too. So if we get storms out of the southwest early in the season, we can see those moths a little bit earlier than we're. That's something to be on the lookout for with armyworm.
It's pretty invasion insect in the Midwest alongside with corn.
It can be, yeah.
What is the recommendation for this season with Mintus in corn?
Okay, so with mites in corn, we really don't know what we're going to get at this time of year, because that arthropod, okay, not an insect, but closely related, it's going to be driven primarily by drought. And so if we get into drought conditions, we start to see those mite populations build up and move into corn and actually especially soybean. We in our part of the world, a week or two where it's up in the high 80s, 90s, and it's dry, we can really start to see those mite populations come on. A lot of times the time of year when we see that in Illinois, corn is sort of well on its way, and while we might get mites in there, a lot of times we don't see major issues from that the way we do with soybean when we have drought conditions. In southern Illinois, over the last few years, we've had some reports of mites earlier in the season, and that can be a concern. And one thing to keep in mind, if your conditions are right, they can really show up anytime. But for most of Illinois, especially if you get into central and northern Illinois, when we do have mites, they tend to be a problem late. And for that reason, they tend to be more of an issue in soybean. The other thing, the last couple of years through central Illinois and northern Illinois, we've been fairly fortunate in that if we've had mites start to pop up in pockets, we've gotten, for the most part, timely rains that have sort of eliminated them. And there's nothing better for mite control than a timely rain. If you get an inch or two of rain on those mite infested fields, most of the time they'll collapse. Like a good gully washer will really take care of those mites in most cases better than a pesticide can. And one thing to keep in mind with mites, they're not an insect, and that means that not just any are a problem, there's some condition in the field that's favoring that. With corn rootworm for us in Illinois right now, it's primarily northern Illinois, and it's primarily continuous cornfields, so corn grown after corn. With white grubs, a lot of times we get into those issues when we're cutting into CRP ground, for instance, to grow a crop, or going into a field that's kind of near a woodlot, has some diverse vegetation around it. You know, wireworms are a little bit squirrely. They can be a little bit difficult to predict. But usually there's some alternative vegetation there in addition to, you know, the corn and the soybean crop that is sort of driving that to occur. And one of the most common situations that causes it, certainly not the only situation, but is when we're transitioning CRP ground to production. Similarly with white grubs, a lot of times that will occur when we're transitioning from like a pasture or a forage into corn or soybean production. Those are the situations where we think about kind of pesticide use early. The other situation to watch out for is when we get into annual weeds, annual broadleaf weeds like winter annuals is what I mean to say, or with grassy weeds early in the season, and we're terminating those very close to when we are planting corn. And if we have that situation with broadleaf weeds, where you have broadleaf weeds dying as the corn plant is coming up, if they're dense enough, that can drive problems with cutworms. With grasses, same situation. You've got grass weeds or a cover crop dying as corn or soybean are coming up, corn in particular. We can see problems with armyworm. Those are also situations where we could need a pesticide early. But what you really want to keep in mind with that, these are insects that you should scout for, that you should scout your fields for early in the season, especially if you have that situation, if you have kind of some struggles with winter annual control, and you need to plant into a field that's a little bit hairy. That's the situation where you should be on the lookout for black cutworms, if it's broadleaves, and true armyworm if it's grasses. Again, these are sporadic insects. These are not pests that we see on every field every year. These are actually pests that we see on a small handful of fields that usually have, you know, some warning signs that it might be an issue in the form of those weeds, or in some cases, cover crops. And again, it's not, if we get a good burn down and we have a good weed-free period before we plant, we're fine with those. One thing to note, like last year, we had very large flights of black cutworm. We did not have widespread problems with black cutworm causing stand loss in corn. And that's because for the most part, we got pretty good winter annual weed control. So we had those weeds burned down well before we planted corn. It's when that burn down is occurring as the corn plants are coming up, or in some cases the soybean plants are coming up, that's when that insect can be problematic. But you need that favorable environment and you need the pest to be present. And that's why scouting is so important for those early season insect pests.
Thanks, Nick.
Oh, you're very welcome, Caesar. Thanks for having me on the show.
This is Nick Seltzer from the University of Illinois in Urbana and Champaign. We are back with our last segment. On back roads of Illinois. Thanks, Nick Seltzer from the University of Illinois. We are watching the weather in central Illinois for this planting season. However, spring is pretty crazy for central Illinois. I talked Marlon B. about the corn market. We'll talk about it. We will see on the commodity markets on the bird flu in Texas. It's pretty scary for the script for the farmers with these issues. What a week. Next to the planting season, kick it off with our planting season. However, only we could do just pray. Well, folks, there are our show for today. We will see you on Monday. For Back Roads of Illinois, I am Cesar Delgado. Have a great weekend.